think he said that Christians and non-Christians alike are same blessing, same good and bad things happening to us. So you don't see blessings and cursings in Deuteronomy in effect today, or?
Oh, I think they're in effect. But I think Paul's point is that God shows faithfulness to the wicked and to the righteous alike, and so that the distinction is relatively hard to see.
Why is that?
It's a fact. But as you look around the world, do you see that Christians are doing visibly a whole lot better than non-Christians? So what's the explanation for that fact? And the explanation, I think, is what he's saying here, that God shows His faithfulness to the sinners and to the saints alike, and that's the question that Paul brings up here. If that's true, then why bother to be a saint? And so that's the question he's going to get to in chapters 6, 7, and 8. Deuteronomy 28, the promises there are two things to say about that. One is they're national. Number two, if you're good, I'll bless you. If you're bad, I'll spank you, is the way things work in the childhood in a very direct way. But when we get to the New Testament, it's, if you're faithful to me, I'll give you the privilege of joining Christ in His suffering. And so there's some twists that come in the New Testament. With the outpouring of the Spirit, God says you get to suffer too and participate in making up what is lacking in the sufferings of Christ, as it says in Colossians. In other words, there's more work to be done. And so there's kind of a more mature form of Deuteronomy 28. So there's a sense in which the principles still apply, but we have to be more subtle in the application of them. Paul is obviously not intending to contradict Deuteronomy 28, but he's making a somewhat different point. Yes, sir?
At the beginning of chapter 3, it talks about what advantage is to the Jews. Well, you kind of hinted at talking about baptism, infant baptism. Could you address the advantage of infant baptism, the idea of moral tradition? What advantage is it for infants to be baptized in the church?
Well, what I meant by referring to infant baptism was more, what advantage do you have growing up in the church and being discipled in the church? Even if you're in a Baptist church that doesn't practice infant baptism, you still get that benefit. The rejection of infant baptism is just a little blip in the history of Christianity, and in another 100 years, Baptists will have disappeared from the face of the earth. I mean, this is a very small cultural trend. It's exclusively tied in with certain modern nominalistic ideas that'll pass off the scene. So really, Baptist children are covenant children too, but their parents don't understand that, and their children are not taught as well as they should be. But then you got the problem with Presbyterians who baptize their children and don't let them come to the table. But if our children are baptized and they're told right along, God claimed you as a baby and you belong to Him. I had to give you up. I had to come and say, I'm not good enough to be a parent. I'm not good enough to be a father, and your mother's not good enough to be a mother. We need help. We gave you to God the Father to be your father and to the church to be your mother. And God raised you from the dead and made you His child, and you've grown up at His table, and we've taught you the Scriptures, then that's an advantage, you see. And that is part of the advantage of being a Jew, that he has these benefits. And Paul will get to that in Romans 9. But here's the thing he points out because of what he's saying. They were entrusted the Word of God to give to other people, and they didn't do it. Okay.
Verses in
19 and 20.
Yeah. It doesn't seem to me that Scripture is talking about the ceremonial aspect of the law. Is there other possibilities I can use?
The problem with Romans is that it is an extremely technical argument. But the study of these various phrases, works of the law, righteousness of the law, they mean different things. And most scholars have now, there have been real intensive studies in Paul by various theologians over the years. And in John Murray's commentary, you start to see some of that coming in, and he starts to make adjustments in the traditional views, and that discussion is going on, and just reinforces the basic Protestant doctrines against the Catholic doctrines, but it does provide a closer understanding of Romans in terms of that century, not in terms of the Protestant Reformation, where Romans was used against the Catholic Church to deal with errors that were somewhat different than the errors that Paul was actually dealing with. With the phrase works of the law, they now are pretty convinced that in Paul that refers to that ceremonial dimension. In Galatians, it refers to the observing of days and years and dietary laws and food and drink and all that kind of stuff. And Paul gets to this again later on in the book. I seriously doubt if we will get as far as chapter 14 and 15, but when he starts talking about the weak and strong believer, the weak believer is a Jewish believer who only eats certain meats and all that kind of stuff. And so it's that aspect or dimension of the law that is the barrier between Jew and Gentile. And at this point, he's saying that barrier, that distinction between Jew and Gentile, the special priestly laws that Israel had, doesn't have anything to do with salvation. That aspect of the law was never given so that people could think that they were closer to God. And so now he's going to say, apart from the law, Jesus has come and brought salvation. And he will expand that by saying, Abraham was saved before he was circumcised and before the law was given. So this will proceed a little bit, but unless you want to get into the literature, this is really my first time to teach through Romans. And so I don't have in my mind every argument. I just have the gist of it.
The people in North Africa who haven't heard. And it seems to me after the other Reformed teachers essentially say that everybody, apart from specific interaction with the Jewish nation or preaching of the gospel in modern times, was lost. And verse that came to my mind was in Ephesians where Paul is talking to you Gentiles in the flesh, where it says that at that time you were without Christ, being aliens from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers from the covenants of promise, having no hope without God in the world.
Well, the first thing I would say is that I think most Reformed people are omitting the Noachic covenant from their discussion. They don't bring it in. They seem to think it's some type of common grace covenant or something. And I don't believe that. So I believe that apart from interaction with Israel, there could easily have been in the Gentile world many God-fearing people whose knowledge went back to the Noachic covenant and whose faith was sustained through the generations from that time on. I don't know how long that lasted or how long God kept it alive or how God deals with people. I don't want to foreclose the matter. I have to leave that a mystery because that doesn't seem to be dealt with. I don't think that Ephesians is meaning to say that everybody outside the commonwealth of Israel was totally without hope in the world because there were Gentile God-fearers. So whatever Paul is saying there in Ephesians, it can't mean that only Jews could be saved. Beyond that, I'm not... What was the verse there? I don't know how, right off the bat, to reconcile that with the clear statement that Gentiles who were not part of the commonwealth of Israel were saved. But all I can say is that there's probably within this universe of discourse here that has a particular meaning. So I don't see any other way to reconcile it. What do you do with Cornelius and the Roman centurion and all these other people? Well, if the sin is punishable by death, there's still a span of time between the commission of that sin and the execution of the criminal, during which time a man might repent and he'd still be put to death, but he'd go to heaven. So the guy's on death row. He has many reasons to think about the faithfulness of God. Every day he hasn't been hanged. God's being faithful to him and giving him one more chance.
About the Garden of Eden?
Yeah.
I need some clarification on how you honored Adam and Eve were God intended them to be part of the Holy Spirit. Could you clarify that for me? I'm not quite certain what you were...
God intended for Adam and Eve to grow up and be transfigured and move into the fullness of the covenant, and they didn't do that.
Okay.
That's why Jesus comes and does it.
How do we determine that God intended that to occur? When do we decide that?
It's there in Genesis 2 and 1. God says to Adam, of every tree of the garden you may eat freely except for the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and you shall not eat from it, for the day you eat of it you will die. Then he says to Adam and Eve, later on after Eve is made, behold, I've given you every tree, it shall be food for you. And so they knew the prohibition on the tree of knowledge was temporary, and that they would eventually get to eat of it, or if they jumped the gun. Now, the effect of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is that they would mature in God-likeness, that their eyes would be open, and that they would become more like God, knowing good and evil. And I discussed those things last time I was here, and I've got papers on it out there, and that's a whole other thing. But if you look at the text, you'll see that the serpent comes and says, in the day you eat this fruit, you'll become more like God, and you'll acquire knowledge of good and evil, which means enthronement as a ruler. And that's the meaning of that phrase if you trace it down in the Bible. And your eyes will be open in a new sense. And as soon as they eat it, it says their eyes were open, and they sowed fig leaves. God says, behold, they become more like us. He calls on them to pass judgment, and He kicks them out. So it does have that effect. But they got that effect wrongly, and it crushed them. They were supposed to mature to the point where they were ready to be glorified and to eat of the tree of knowledge. So that's how we know that there was a second covenant, a second phase of life that's implied there. And then there are proof texts for that in the rest of the Bible. 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says, if there is a natural body, then there is a spiritual body, which says that it's inescapable by implication of the first creation that there had to be a maturation into a new creation. And again, there's a whole realm of stuff there that would take a couple of lectures to expound in detail. I do have some written material on it I'd be happy to show you that lay out all the arguments and give it in detail if you want to look at it more. Yes, sir?
This word service or servant, word giant indicated
the Greek word...
consecrating acts of the temple or tabernacle?
Well, the word latriuo is used for worship service and ceremonial service. And there's an implied contrast, and I kind of expanded on it here because in anticipation, Paul discusses this in Romans and other places. But there's a contrast between the way the Pharisees thought that service ought to go, which was by ritually consecrating things, and what the gospel proclaims as the way that service is to go, which is by living in the Spirit and allowing the consecration of things, so to speak, to flow out from us. Yes, sir?
Did Jesus retain humanness as the Christ?
Oh, yes, glorified humanity. See, He is the new Adam who becomes glorified the way the old Adam wasn't. And in union with Him, we will be glorified. We are already being glorified, and that will be finished up. So He will be a human being forever. There's nothing humiliating about Christ becoming a human being. If you make a beautiful set of clothes and put it on, you're not humiliating yourself, you're glorifying yourself. The Bible says that the universe was made as a garment for God, and human beings are the most beautiful and wonderful part of creation. And so, for God to take on human nature is a way of glorifying Himself, not of humbling Himself. What was humbling about the Incarnation was that Jesus came in a damaged body, a body damaged by Adamic sin. But now it's glorified, and so God glorifies Himself by wearing the garment of creation forever. There's no reason why He would take it off. Yes, sir?
Would you comment on the fact that the high priests were the only ones who were able to go close to the altars and the Holy of Holies in once a year, correlated to what the Catholic Church is doing today with the priest is called Father, and you have to confess the things to the priest, and there's a separation that only the people can't touch the land and all that aspect. Does that have something to do with holy order?
Yeah. The question is there a relationship between orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism and Anglo-Catholicism, and the barriers between the congregation and the sacraments and the Old Testament barriers? Well, yes and no. They would not see those patterns as coming from the Old Testament because they would agree with us that that's all changed. Where they actually come from is from the instinct of the human heart, which is always to fall back into the old way and to say, well, to make God really holy, we have to surround it with mystery, and we have to put up these barriers and only let certain people do it. That's built into the sinfulness of our heart. And so to the extent of which we don't really grasp the freeness of the gospel, we will trend back in that direction. And so that's what's actually happened there. It's more of a psychological thing than it is a theological thing. But yes, there are direct parallels. Only the priest can do certain things, and you've got this wall, and only the priest can go back in there, and there's this hidden stuff and all this. And it's because everybody wants it that way. And the instinct that they are manifesting is the instinct to live in the old sinful way instead of in the new freedom of the Spirit. Yes, sir?
I'm just wondering, in light of talking about what Christ telling us about the living water from one another to one another.
That's about what gardens, when water flows out of gardens.
What is the importance of being close to each other to do that? It's like Paul, it's almost like you're saying it can't happen when Paul is with them.
Well, it really can happen in a good way unless Paul is with them, and that's why Paul writes in Hebrews, do not forsake the assembling of one another. You can't get this through books.
The letter writing, the internet, and all that. That's not
the internet, letter writing, drive-in churches, no good. Bad scene. No, you've got to be in the church rubbing shoulders with all these disagreeable, contentious people in order to get, the iron sharpening iron aspect. And we don't like that, and so, we tend to isolate ourselves and get offended or just decide that, none of these churches are doctrinally pure enough for me to belong to or whatever, because we can think of a lot of excuses not to be nose to nose and bad breath to bad breath with people in the church. But yeah, you've got to be there. And that's one of the problems with praying to saints. And I'm glad you raised that because I've never even made this connection. But you can't one another with the saint. These Catholic churches and the Eastern Church, they pray to these saints. The saints don't talk back. They say they're there, but they're not. Any more than we can be one another with the church with people in China. You can only really do this if you're immediately with somebody else. Now, the Holy Spirit can work through the Word and other things, but in terms of the personal dynamic, you got to be in community, local, face-to-face, mouth-to-ear, where I can say things that offend you and you can say things that offend me. So that's kind of how it works. Yes, sir?
I was watching a whole talk that we as saints God. When a brother called us to do a mission of that nature, then we'll gather and lay on hands. How does that compare with the going out?
It's still human beings that are being anointed. Okay, that's my point. You can anoint with oil for the sick. You can lay hands on human beings. Technical term for that is manual imposition. Those two rites set aside human beings for special work. But what I was commenting on was the business of consecrating springs of water in the spring, or ships, or houses, or holy cars, or, having the priest bless this or bless that. That's all a way of trying to say we're extending the kingdom to all the world, but it's precisely the wrong way of doing it. Because we have been made priests, everything we touch is being worked with the priest and thereby sanctified. Another way to put it.
Is there a scripture you can recommend reading about the angels ruling the world?
Oh, angels in charge of the world before Christ. Let's see, Hebrews chapter 2, verse 2. Words spoken through angels proved unalterable. How shall we escape if we neglect so great a salvation? Let's see. See if there are cross references right there that get me quick. Acts 7:53. You who received the law ordained by angels and did not keep it. Galatians 3:19. That was Acts 7:53. Galatians 3:19. Why the law then? It was added because of transgression having been ordained through angels by the agency of a mediator. The law was given through angels. Galatians 3:19. Yes.
Is that not also reflected in the Christophany and Theophany field?
Well, yeah, the fact that when God appears, He's the angel of the Lord and not the Son of God.
Yeah.
That's the primary way in which that's seen. We'll go till 9. Now, this is not an official church meeting, so ladies may ask questions. As far as I'm concerned, now, of course, if you have no rule on that, okay. But so far, I've only gotten questions from men, which is really offensive. No, it's not. It's not. Yeah, well. Sam?
The Orthodox have a false view of consecration.
Yes.
So, is worship in an Orthodox church valid?
Well, it depends on the church, but I think God overlooks our sins. He has to overlook a lot of ours, and I think God is generous to overlook the sins and foibles of other Christians, but we want to be as accurate as possible and have to say to them, on this particular point, which is a fairly major point, you're off.
We're relying on the fact that being saints, we are sanctifying them when we go to the church.
Well, if they're saints, then they sanctify themselves. They may have a wrong understanding of everything, but if they're saved, they're still saints.
Is all sanctification the same thing?
I'm not sure what you're asking. I think this is getting us off. Sanctification was growth in holiness of God, growth in freedom of access with God, growth in purity, as far as human beings are concerned. Yes, sir?
You brought up the Greeks and the barbarians. Interesting. The Old Testament, you talk about the statue of Nebuchadnezzar and the training of the 4 kingdoms. It's actually there are sort of 5 kingdoms there. I have 2 parts of this question. One is that fifth, after the lakes and the force of iron, then you have the 10 kingdoms which have iron and clay bits. How do they play in that picture? Are they also protected, or is there something else going on there? First and secondly, since there are 4 kingdoms, and Paul mentioned the Lord, and why did he mention Greece? Why not one of the other ones?
It's a complicated question to answer. The feet mixed with clay in the statue correlate to the little horn in the vision of the beasts and correlate to the willful king in Daniel 11. And that's all, I think, referring to the Herods, the mixture with the Edomites. And when you get down to the Gospels, it's just the Herods, the Romans, and the Jews who put Jesus on trial. It's the Herods, the Romans, the Jews who put Paul on trial. In the Old Testament, that's always the triad. And so that is what I argue in the Daniel commentary. The other half of your question was, why doesn't he refer to the Romans instead of the Greeks? It's because, although the Romans politically ruled the world, the civilization was Hellenistic. And I think that the 4 heads of the Greek leopard, the first head is Alexander, the second and third heads are the kings of the north and the south, which are in Daniel 11. And the 4th head, I would say, is Hellenistic Rome, up until Nero goes wicked, and then it becomes Satanic Rome, and that's the 7th head in Revelation, is Satanic Rome. That's how I interpret it, and I've got that discussed in that paper on orientation in Revelation. Of course, I want to sell all this stuff. It is true that some of your questions, it's easier for me to answer just by giving a footnote and saying, this is it real quick, and my arguments are over here. Okay? 30 seconds. Last chance, ladies. Okay.
So much of what you write about, think about God manages, who's different working towards it. And the thing that I don't understand, I'm trying to understand, is why so much of the evangelical work is either blind to that, doesn't want to say that fact, or doesn't understand it. What's going on? I'm just trying to understand some of what's going on.
Well, the evangelical world, over the last 150 years, the Anabaptist ideal of Christianity has completely taken over the evangelical world. And so the evangelical scholars will say there cannot be such a thing as a Christian nation. Evangelism is revivalistic rather than theocratic. The gospel is reduced to how God saves individual people, and that's the only aspect of it. And so every week in church, that's what you do. You save people over and over again, and you never wind up building in these other things. And all of that is simply the victory of the Anabaptist separatist idea, which says this world is going to go to hell, we're going to get raptured out of it. The biblical model is that the wicked get raptured out of the world. This is our world. And as this world continues into eternity, we keep it and they're kicked out. And that was the view of the Reformers. And the Reformers interpret the Bible not only as it applies to individuals, but also as it applies to history and society, because God is 3 and 1, so it applies to individuals and to society and history. But that's just been lost. And the full deal on that, the history of revivalism, there's a paper by Peter Leichhardt, may still be a copy up there, called Revivalism in American Civilization, where he basically shows how revivalism progressively crumbled the theocratic vision of civilization that came from the Reformers, and left us with individualism and anti-world, anorexic, world-denying theology.
If I could read a passage and have you comment on it in respect to its relevance to your comments on righteousness. It's 1 John 3, verse 4. Whoever commits sin also commits lawlessness, and sin is lawlessness. And you know that He was manifested to take away our sins, and in Him there is no sin. Whoever abides in Him does not sin. Whoever sins has neither seen Him nor known Him. Little children, let no one deceive you. He who practices righteousness is righteous, just as he is righteous. He who sins is of the devil, for the devil has sinned from the beginning. For this purpose the Son of God was manifested, that He might destroy the works of the devil. Whoever has been born of God does not sin, for his seed remains in him, and he cannot sin because he has been born of God. In this the children of God and the children of the devil are manifest. Whoever does not practice righteousness is not of God, nor is he who does not love his brother. It appears from that text as though the Apostle John is contrasting sin and righteousness and defines sin as the transgression of the law, which I don't know if you were defining righteousness within that context of Romans, because you seem to say that it's not necessarily measuring up to a standard in respect to God has the standard of the law, we don't measure up to it, and therefore we're not righteous. Can you explain, maybe I've misunderstood you, or maybe the relevance of that text?
All right. Well, what does the law concern? It concerns our relationship with God and our relationship with other people, not being righteous in ourselves. So it doesn't seem to me that there's any... one could say that righteousness means doing what the law says. But in terms of the Bible, in terms of the covenant, righteousness in doing the law has to be seen in relational categories and not in merit categories. There is no merit theology in the Bible where you have to be righteous and therefore God enters into a relationship with you. And because we aren't righteous, therefore God doesn't enter into a relationship with us. But Jesus came and He did merits and He was right, and so on the basis of that God entered into a relationship with Him. That's not the picture. The picture is we've broken the relationship with God, and that's why we do wrong things. And God, through Jesus, reinitiates a relationship with us, and that's why we do right things. There is no covenant of works. There is no works that precede faith. And Jesus didn't do works that preceded God accepting Him. He simply remained faithful in the relationship. So you have to realize that when you take these words like law and obey the law, you have to see them in a biblical covenantal category and not in a Greek I do right and therefore I am right category. And I was trying to make that contrast here. Here, the whole book of John is concerned with relationships, relationship with God, relationships with the brother. And so I don't have any trouble reading the passage that way. The one who practices righteousness is righteous. One who lives in right relationship with God, as the law defines it, is righteous. The one who practices sin is out of relationship with God. He's with the devil. The Son of God came to destroy the works of the devil, and so forth. I don't see a problem there. Maybe that's elucidation helps you to see that I'm not rejecting the idea of the law as a standard of what these relationships are, but I'm trying to say the relationships are, especially a relationship with God, is what is in focus in that term, righteousness.
It seems to me that, at least in our culture, when we speak of relationships, that they're almost some kind of ethereal, kind of touchy-feely type of thing, where it's not really something that you do. And I think maybe that's the way that it hit me personally. But the book of John seems to say righteousness is something that you practice. It's an act. A relationship is something that is acted out. It's not something that's just
Felt.
right.
Sure.
And atmospheric, so to speak.
Yeah. Although there is an atmospheric dimension to it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, you want to throw that out, but it's not
right.
Specifically that.
Yeah.
What you said kind of hit me that way, and I just wanted to get a little broader picture there.
Am I satisfying you now? Okay.
Thanks.
Sure. The content of the relationship is defined by the law and the covenantal relationship. But you'll notice that at the last judgment, Jesus, in Matthew 25, He doesn't say those on the right hand trusted Christ and those on the left didn't. Nor does He say those on the right hand, wound up being righteous, so to speak. He says those on the right hand did these things with other people, and those on the left hand did not do these things with other people. And sometimes we lose sight of that. We think, well, that's Catholic or salvation by works or something. Well, it really isn't. It's just what faithfulness means.
Two things. First, kind of maybe a follow-up to that. Book of Micah, what's required of man to do justice, love mercy. Seems like justice is, some people say, a synonymous term with the term used for righteousness. mercy, covenantal faithfulness. Are those more or less kind of parallelisms then, or different aspects of covenantal faithfulness? Then the second question, completely different topic. Going back to last night, you mentioned the Herodian kings, the relationship to the book of Daniel, I believe. In Acts 25, second half of the chapter, we see Agrippa and Festus coming together, discussing things about Paul, and then Paul coming in and talking to Agrippa. Do you think there is a significance there to a Roman ruler meeting with King Agrippa in relationship to that prophetic movement during the New Testament age?
Well, first of all, you've got dozens of terms like righteousness and justice and peace and mercy and long-suffering. It's not that they mean different things. I feel like they're more like facets of a diamond. They're all different ways of getting at the same thing. So, without trying to go back to Micah, and I don't have that in my mind, but one doesn't want to make too great a contrast between these terms because they're more like different ways of getting at the same big thing. And I'm just going to have to leave it there rather than try to go into that. In Acts, Jesus is put on trial by Herod, Pilate, and the Jews, and so is Paul. And the conflict between Herod, the Herods were very close to the Roman emperors. If you've ever seen the film, the television series I, Claudius, you notice that Herod is there. He's one of Claudius's friends. And that's why the Herods can be the face of Rome in Palestine. They really were Rome's agents. And yet their whole history goes back to Esau. And so they have this whole root in the Old Testament that's finally come into expression. They're the brother-brother relationship, where the Romans are the outsider relationship and the Jews is the sanctuary relationship. But beyond that, I don't really know, except that Christ lives in us, and so Christ lives in Paul, and that's made very dramatic in Acts because Paul does all the things Jesus does. He goes on 3 missionary journeys, and then he travels to Jerusalem, and this is exactly the sequence of events in the Gospel, and then he's put on trial by these 3 courts. Was that what you were raising, or was there something more specific?
Well, last night you talked about the progression of you were discussing the progression of the kingdoms and the empires, the 4 phases of empire.
Uh-huh.
And then the finer tuning of that somehow involving the Herodian kings.
Yeah.
Aspect of that.
Yeah, they're the clay that's mixed with the iron. It's really terracotta, but I think that the clay mixed with the iron is the Herodian line mixed in then with the Roman iron.
Yeah. So, in that flow of Romans you talked about last night, where that's really kind of what we're seeing happen, and all that is now being changed.
Yeah.
So now we have in Acts 25, so that kind of is saying, it shows the movement away from that and the judgment of that after the second witness, I suppose.
It shows that the link between Rome and Herod, I don't know what else it might show, except that this is still going on down to AD 70, when you have the final destruction of the land beast or the false prophet, and that's Herod, and the sea beast, which is Rome, and the false city, which is Jerusalem. You know, those are wiped away as such in AD 70. But you still have it functioning here. Was there something else? Okay. Uh-huh.
In the view you gave us today on Paul taking to the gospel to the Jew first and also to the Greek, do you think it sheds some light on this passage in Acts 16, where it says, "Now when they had gone through Phrygia and the region of Galatia, they were forbidden by the Holy Spirit to preach the word in Asia"?
Not necessarily, because Asia there means Asia Minor, which was part of the Hellenistic Roman Empire, and we do have the churches in Asia Minor, and they are Roman cities. So that would not seem to fit if it had said they were forbidden to go into Persia. But I think the disciples did go into Persia, and they did go to all the other, they did go down to Ethiopia after the eunuch went there. It's just the New Testament doesn't focus on that. It focuses on the empire and the Jew in their relationship, because it's really continuing to spin out the end of the Old Covenant. And we're just supposed to understand that the gospel also went other places as well. It went to barbarians. But it's actually the Jew-Greek relationship that's in focus in the narratives. But I'm afraid that one probably doesn't fit in. There's something else going on there.
I got one more that has nothing to do with what you talked about today directly, but it has to do with, well, you talked about it indirectly. And it has to do with the passage I read at the end of our service, where it says, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age." And I get somewhat confused from time to time thinking about the ages, and it seems like a lot is pinned on that age between Christ and the destruction of Jerusalem.
Yeah, a lot is.
And so would this passage be something like that? Help me think through that a little.
What verse was that? I'm trying to find that.
Ephesians 6, verse 12.
Against the world forces of this darkness. What does your version say? Read your version again.
Okay, it says, "The rulers of the darkness of this age."
Okay. Yeah, they have translated the word ion as world. If it is to be translated darkness of this age, then that would refer to the period before AD 70. You've got it in Romans and other places. Actually, the book of Revelation itself. Let me see if I can find it here. Yeah, Romans 13, verse 12. The night is almost gone, the day is at hand. And the book of Revelation starts off at night. You see a lampstand burning. You see stars. Stars are in Jesus' hand. When we go into heaven, there are lampstands and stars. At the end of the book, you've moved from evening to morning, and it's light. But in Revelation chapter 12, where we see the woman in the sky, that's astral. So it's nighttime. We're moving through watches of the night for the day to come. And so the business of night giving way to day has its first fulfillment in the period from 30 to 70 A.D. Of course, there's still darkness in the world, and we're still wrestling against principalities and powers. The book of Revelation says that the dragon is not dealt with until after the millennium. The beast and the false prophet are dealt with in AD 70, but Satan isn't fully dealt with until Christ comes again. So there's an extended meaning, but I think that usually in context, the first meaning of the darkness that we struggle against has a special meaning for that generation. They were in a particularly dire circumstance. Yes. Yes, Leviticus 15. Anyone who has an issue from the privates may not draw near to offer sacrifice. That woman had not been able to go to Passover, and she had not been able to offer sacrifice for 12 years because she had an issue. Gentiles also had to be clean in order to offer sacrifice. I don't remember, though, that the woman who had an issue of 12 years was a Gentile, though. Same with leprosy. Leviticus chapter 13 and 14. If a man had leprosy, he could not draw near to worship God. So all the healings in the Gospels have to do with giving people access to worship and restoring them as a nation of priests. Which is interesting. You know, it's not just random healings. God is interested in health, but the specific thing in the Gospels has to do with His call to service, not just making you well. Yes, sir.
Teach them to apply them to obedience to Gentiles. Any text you point us to which help God would have intended the Israelites of that day to help them understand that?
Where the boundary is, which laws you take and which ones you don't take? Leviticus 17 and 18. Leviticus 17 and 18 deal with the food laws and laws of uncleanness and the ones that apply to the Gentiles. And in Acts, the Acts chapter 15, when the question comes up, how much of the law should we put the Gentiles under? It's those precise four things that are mentioned. The laws of incest, the laws of not drinking blood. And if you study that, I have a paper on that, but if you study that out, you'll find that's the case. Just very quickly, in the context of Leviticus, which has already started out and said this is stuff that applies within the boundaries of Israel because you are priests, you're the ones offering the sacrifices, these laws of uncleanness only apply to you. Then in chapter 17, this refrain starts up in verse 8. Well, let's just put it this way. Leviticus chapter 11, verses 1 and 2. Okay, look at that. Yahweh spoke again to Moses and Aaron, saying to them, "Speak to the sons of Israel, saying, These are the creatures you may eat." See that?
Everybody who wants to see that, Leviticus 1 verse 2. Speak to the sons of Israel and say, these are the creatures you may eat. Leviticus chapter 12 verse 2. Speak to the sons of Israel, saying, when a woman gives birth and bears a male child, she shall be unclean 7 days. Okay? Now, Leviticus chapter 15. Yahweh spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, speak to the sons of Israel and say, when a man has an issue from his flesh, the issue is unclean. For a woman to have her monthly cycle among the Gentiles did not make her unclean, but among the Jews it did, because they were holy. Now, chapter 17. Notice the contrast in language. Leviticus 17, verse 8. Then you shall say to them, any man from the house of Israel, or from the aliens who sojourn among you, who offers an ascension offering or a peace sacrifice and doesn't bring it to the doorway of the tent shall be cut off. Okay? Verse 10. Any man from the house of Israel or from the aliens who sojourn among them who eats any blood, I will set my face against him. Verse 13. When any man of the sons of Israel or from the aliens who sojourn among them catches a beast that may be eaten, he shall pour out his blood. Verse 15, when any man eats an animal that dies by itself or is torn by beasts, whether he is a native or an alien, he shall wash his clothes and bathe in water. And finally, chapter 18, which gives all the laws of incest, okay, who you can marry and who you can't. Verse 26, as for you, you are to keep my statutes and my judgments, not do any of these abominations, neither the native nor the alien who sojourns among you. So in Leviticus, there is a clear distinction between the things that are addressed specifically to Israel and the things that are addressed to both. And then when James in the Jerusalem Council, the question comes up, what do we load on the Gentile converts? He goes right here. We load on them, of course, the Ten Commandments and the moral law and all the other laws, Deuteronomy, but out of the ceremonial aspect of the law, we load on them these 4 things. It works out very well. So that's the beginning of the answer to your question. The full answer would be, a 20-hour course in biblical law, but that's the beginning of the answer. Okay.
Could they have celebrated Passover as Gentiles?
No, you cannot celebrate Passover if you're a Gentile. Exodus. You can celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles. The Gentiles are invited to that, but verse 48 of Exodus 12, Exodus 12:48. If a stranger sojourns with you and celebrates the Passover to Yahweh, let all his males be circumcised, and then let him come near to celebrate it, and he shall be like a native of the land, but no uncircumcised person can eat of it.
That was the point. If you were to go out and do evangelism, and you would say you want to have full participation in the community, you're going to want to be circumcised.
No, you shouldn't say that. You shouldn't say if you want to have full participation in the covenant life of the community. You should say if you want to join the army and be part of the special missionary people of God, you'll be circumcised and come to Passover. See the difference? Because they have full participation by faith. That's Paul's whole argument. The Gentile who's uncircumcised has full participation by faith in the community of believers among the Gentiles. We grow up being nebulous on this question, and that's why I'm addressing it to try to sort it out. Okay? Because in the Reformed faith, a lot of times we equate circumcision with baptism. And circumcision is not exactly the same as baptism. Baptism takes up circumcision because now all of us are in the army. But in the Old Testament, some people were in the army and some people weren't. And if you wanted to join the army, you got circumcised and you went to Passover. And then you came under all these other rules. If you didn't want to join the army, you were in the mixed multitude that was gathered around the tabernacle, and you could still draw near and offer sacrifice, and you could come to the Feast of Tabernacles, but the one thing you couldn't do was go to Passover, because it was just for the circumcised. You may not be persuaded, but that's the way I'm calling it.
A sign and seal of the covenant for a Gentile?
It's the sign and the seal of the special priestly covenant. The sign and seal of the covenant to the Gentiles is the rainbow, the Noachic covenant. You see, what kind of community was there in Melchizedek's Salem? That's the community they're part of. The Noachic believing community. Yeah, Jethro's household. Was that a full covenant community? Yeah, under the Noachic covenant.
So we don't have any reason to think they were circumcised necessarily.
No, because we know they weren't circumcised, because Moses did not circumcise his family when he was living with Jethro, Only when he went back into the promised land and joined the people of God, and God said, okay, it's time to circumcise. There was a question over here.
There seems to be a growing practice among dispensationalists to practice the Passover at Easter time. You got any comments about that? It seems like from what you're saying, it would be almost a ridiculous thing to do.
It's sloppy. And the second aspect of doing the Passover that's really sloppy is what they're doing is a Talmudic Passover. They've got all these things that have grown up in post-biblical Judaism. Now, we got an egg here, and we've got this plate with 7 things on it, and we've got this piece of bread that's broken into 3 pieces and hidden in. They've got this Christ in the Passover thing. That's kind of like Christ in the Koran, or Christ in the Bhagavad Gita. I mean, the Mishnah Talmud Passover is something that developed several centuries after the New Testament and has got nothing to do with the work of Christ. The only thing that typifies the work of Christ are the few things mentioned in the Bible, which is a lamb and so forth. So the whole thing, I think, is just bizarre and silly. I mean, I'm sure God loves these people and they mean well, but if they understood the Bible and history better, I think they wouldn't do it. Now, I'm trying to be, gracious, but I mean, it doesn't make any sense when you look at it a second time.
I guess it seems, maybe I don't know what's all going on in the world of missions today, but it doesn't seem like there's a lot of missions coming forth out of the Reformed circle. Maybe that's changing or growing, but everywhere I look, particularly in my area, in India, I see Baptists and Pentecostals and lots of others, but I don't see the Orthodox or people doing missions, and the dispensational people are doing all kinds of things.
Well, I think there are 2 reasons for that. One is, at the present time in history, there are a whole lot more charismatics and dispensationalists than there are Reformed people. So, when you compare the numbers, that's what you see. Second of all these groups have different nations they target. I mean, the Presbyterians have done a whole lot of stuff in Korea. The Anglicans did a whole lot of stuff in certain parts of Africa. You're looking at India, you're probably looking at a nation where other groups have targeted more. Because Reformed theologians are much higher grade theologians than Pentecostal, if there are any charismatic theologians, I mean real ones, I don't mean that as an insult, they're not interested in theology. Okay? When they study theology, they usually get a few Reformed books and use them. And same with dispensationalists. You go to Dallas Seminary and you wind up using a bunch of Reformed books as textbooks. They don't have theologians. So they're not as consistent. Their eschatology tells them nothing's going to happen, but they're not consistent with it. But Reformed people tend to be intellectuals, and they tend to be much more consistent. And so amillennialism has more of an influence in the whole Reformed scene because of that tendency toward consistency. And the happy inconsistency of the charismatic means that he thinks Jesus is coming soon, but he's also all excited about the Spirit. And so he's out there being a missionary and being postmillennial, even though it contradicts what he thinks. And I think that's part of it too. Well, if it was postmillennial Reformed theology, yeah, that's what led to the modern missionary movement in the first place, was postmillennial Reformed theology. Expansive, optimistic. We know all these nations are going to convert. We just got to take Jesus out there and it's going to happen. Then they decided the nations weren't going to convert anymore, and that has, naturally has a way of kind of dampening your enthusiasm. Yes, sir? Amillennialism developed in the Netherlands after the Dutch lost their empire, around the early 1800s. It developed in the South after the South lost the Civil War in the 1870s. Up till that time, all the Southerners were postmillennials. The Dutch influence came into Presbyterianism in America. Northern Presbyterianism was still postmillennial. Warfield, Hodge, those guys, they didn't lose it. They won the war, so they didn't lose their postmillennial hope, you see. This is really true. But when Westminster Theological Seminary was formed, they drew heavily on the resources of the Christian Reformed men. Ned Stonehouse. See, we say Stonehouse, but his name is Steinhuis. He was Dutch. E.J. Young, we spell it Y-O-U-N-G, but originally it was J-O-N-G. He was Dutch. Van Til, everybody but Machen, who was a post-mill, and O.T. Alice, who were post-mills. All the rest of them were amills, and the result is Dutch amillennial thinking just came in and swept through and took over all of Presbyterianism. Southern Presbyterians had already become premills, And a lot of them have become dispies. And the Scofield Reference Bible was the Bible of the Southern Presbyterian Church. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise either, because it was. I mean, I was there. And in the North, the Dutch amillennialism came through. It's too bad, but the fact is, when you lose a war, you tend to become amil. When the Dutch lost their empire, they became amils. The British didn't, of course, because they kept theirs. Then the British became amils, and now they're all becoming Muslims.